Hello and welcome to Let's H. I'm Cho, your host and essayist. If you like what I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon. None of my videos are monetized, and I'm sure most all of you are well aware of YouTube's problems related to that. But it's not just YouTube. Most monetized platforms have comparable issues. Thus, I rely on my patrons and commission work. I appreciate it. Today I'm going to be covering 13 problem points with Harry Potter and the Wizarding World. My disclaimer here is that my memory may not be perfect, and I've experienced the story in a number of media, including games, film, and the written word, from Rowling and from fan authors, and even my own imaginings. I don't really consider myself a fan, but I'm also not really a hater either. It's complicated. For a while, when the series was at its peak, before and during The Prisoner of Azkaban, the third in the series, I was acquainted with a fellow who really wore out its welcome on me. I ended up very put off and didn't acknowledge the series even until after it had been over for some time, but I won't go into all the details and why and all the unpleasantness. I just didn't care for it, and his dwelling on it repeatedly made it very hard to tolerate. But I ended up playing Lego Harry Potter, and it's from that experience that I was able to move past what had really become a hatred at that point. I don't regret that. I'm glad that I could enjoy some of the magic, and now I can see some of those magical things and enjoy some of the delight of at least the ideas of the stories. It's a wonderful fantasy to imagine, a school in a castle, long and far away from everything modern society, away from awful parents and unpleasant peers, in a place where you can really make magic happen. And I've always loved trains and train rides. The thought of riding in a special magical train to some secret magic place just takes my breath away. There's this painting I saw of Harry with his head slightly out the train window, looking up and happy as the wind swept his hair, and that's one of my favorite pieces of art related to this series. I can feel it when I look at it, and that's wonderful. But that also neatly segues into my first point, because I'm going to have to get started if I ever hope to be finished. The story really doesn't know what it wants to be. If you take the first book, it's a fine self-contained story. It doesn't really have anywhere to go from there, and that much is pretty apparent by the Chamber of Secrets. It's like a pilot that was unexpectedly picked up, but the production staff didn't actually have any scripts for the rest of the series. And you can see this especially in the later books of the series, where it's apparent Rowling didn't think things through and ended up presenting some hella awkward situations by way of retcon, retroactive continuity for those who don't know the term. I can think of no better example than Peter Pettigrew retroactively being Scabbers. Ron Weasley, aged at most 11, bathed with Scabbers, who showed absolutely no real sign of being evil, much less as intelligent as an animagus could be assumed to be. When we meet Sirius Black, even his canine form is sharp as a tack. But that aside, the thought of this horrible man constantly in animal form bathing with a young Ron is far more disturbing than I'm sure Rowling ever considered or intended. But if the story had stayed as fun magic school hijinks, the series could have continued forever, or at least indefinitely. Since Rowling is so desperate for relevancy and has kept churning out works set in the same world, you'd think she would have thought of this before a series of dick moves known as the last 3.5 books of Harry Potter. I had always preferred the Worst Witch series if I had to choose a magic school adventure series, which was firmly brushed under the rug while Harry Potter was popular, though even that series jumped the shark and ended up in a stupid place, but after decades of running and being quite good. The same is true of Terry Pratchett's Discworld. It eventually was not nearly as good as it had been, but we at least had decades worth of stories to enjoy. It's mainly due to pretension and pretentiousness that the entire last act of Harry Potter's story even takes its sharp turn. It's the finale, it knows it, and it's striking the sets and burning them to ashes, which is a tragedy in so many ways, and one of the most potent ways is how it dispenses abruptly with so much of the whimsy and wonder, making it seem like a dour, bleak world indeed. Why would anyone think going to the Wizarding World from the mundane world is an escape? It stops serving that function of a portal. By the last act, no one really wants to go to such a miserable place, and it certainly doesn't help that so much time is spent outside of the Wizarding World by that point. But when the tone shifts halfway through, so many of the really delightful elements disappear, or they're given far less significance than before. The Hogwarts Express and the Sweets Cart, House points, Quidditch, even Hogsmeade are all tossed under the bus, made absolutely wretched and joyless, or both. It makes the reader feel awkward for ever giving them any esteem or importance, which is a lamentable choice and, in my opinion, a huge mistake for any writer. You can't build up things to be crucial elements of the world and the plot, then later have them still exist but be completely insignificant and tertiary at best to the plot. It makes the reader feel stupid. and then it immediately asks that same reader to take the new system of values it presents to them. That's remarkably presumptuous, and it's setting oneself up for failure. It would be like writing a book that is beloved by all upon its release, then for the follow-up having the first line be, "But to hell with that first book, it was shit anyway and you're a moron if you liked it." So many of the reasons anyone has to love the Wizarding World in the first place are tossed aside to concentrate on teen angst and a cycle of history far more interesting the first time around, which didn't make much sense to rehash a few years later. When the tone of a work is set, in order to present itself a certain way, it expects the audience to take it as it is presented. Whimsical adventures of young people in magic school can handwave quite a lot, since one doesn't have to take it extremely seriously. But serious business action that takes itself gravely is a very, very different matter. It's why most stories that revolve around action, angst, and drama are either simplified or at the very least streamlined to provoke less serious thought and examination. When Harry Potter's tone shifts so sharply it gives us all whiplash, it immediately makes it impossible to ignore, at the very least, all the major problems, plot holes, and inconsistencies from there on out. It also makes it impossible to ignore things like the very real child abuse committed by the Dursleys, who are not excused from evil acts simply because they were scared or hurt. Fear is not an excuse for atrocity, and it should never be explained away as if we're supposed to sympathize or forgive. More than curses, that sort of abuse is unforgivable, but it's never given due weight to consideration by the story at all. Worse, it's most often played almost as a joke. I'll touch upon this more later, but I think it is worth noting at this point that this should be extended past the Dursleys, past the Muggles, and to the Wizarding World, and in specific its governing body, not to mention the Death Eaters. I say again, fear is not an excuse for atrocity, and despite that point looming over everything from a very early stage of the story, it's not skillfully or consistently applied at all, which really means that either it wasn't an intended point by the author and she didn't consider that, or she was terrible at trying to make a point with her writing. In any case, even setting those features aside, it changes the entire setting in a way that doesn't do the larger narrative any favors. If anything, the series could have, and should have, focused on individual problems with the world if it intended to address them. There could be an arc dealing with the problems in the Wizarding World's government, the problems with the Death Eaters still existing as a concept, the tension between pure-blooded mages and Muggle-borns, the question of Muggles and the dangers they present, and the list goes on. Structurally and quality-wise, it's very clear that Rowling didn't have really much anything in the way of ideas when she abruptly decided to change the story's whole tone and direction. It's most apparent with Order of the Phoenix, which seems not to have had the slightest editorial oversight or any revisions whatsoever. It's a mess that struggles to find any sort of direction and stuffs in anything and everything it can in hopes to get to the grand finale. It is, more than most middle chapters, just filling time as the story moves sluggishly from point A to point B, and that's a shame because it could have been something far better. But then, so could the rest of the series. Everyone hates a Nazi, but the Nazi parallels and World War II parallels that densely pack the latest story are unsubtle and not particularly skillfully employed. It should have been a series about that if it wanted to tell that story again. The way the last couple of books read, it's like Rowling became fascinated with the Second World War and just really wanted to recreate that atmosphere in her books for some unknowable reason. But the problem with that is that even though we celebrate the determination and drive of the people of Britain during that time, it wasn't a good time. For anyone, children most especially, and that's not really adequately covered in a story which revolves around them. It also ironically shows us a completely unsatisfying post-war epilogue, which rings with authenticity since post-war Britain was a complete and utter shithole governed execrably and not worthy of glorifying or glossing over. It also really isn't helped by the fact that the earlier conflict with Voldemort was much more interesting, even if it extremely unrealistically lasted 11 years. This was less the Second Wizarding War and more like an "oh, by the way" tacked onto the first one, which, I will concede, is matched somewhat by real life again. But it doesn't make for good storytelling. When huge parts of the conflict are picking up from a decade earlier and we don't know about the background until later, that's not acceptable. When countless retcons cast a completely different, and likely unintended, light upon characters and their actions, that's not good development. And the long and short of it is this: don't suddenly change the entire crux of the narrative just because you got a new interest, if you're going to try streamlining your story. especially if you're doing it for mass consumption, which, let's face it, most writers are. You need to keep your tone consistent and keep your direction a steady focus. The Harry Potter series accomplishes none of that. It builds to nothing and then resolves nothing it introduced. The Magic School adventures at first are whimsical and largely centered around world building. The conflicts in the first 3 books build slowly, with more of an emphasis on fleshing out the world around Harry and his friends and contemporaries. It feels more organic to the narrative in these stories since the emphasis is on Harry's experiences at Hogwarts and him accepting his inheritance of sorts. Later on, Rowling seems to want to have her cake and eat it too, which is to say that she wants to cram in world building where it typically feels incongruous and disturbs the momentum of the narrative. She has made a concerted choice by this point to redefine the entire tone of the series, but she refuses to really resolve the elements that no longer suit it. In some ways it's the same mistake that Tolkien could be considered to have made. In wanting so much to flesh out his world, he would often take asides that could become excursions of their own, and to such excess that the main track of the story could sometimes be lost in an exploration of less relevant matters and characters. But one can also excuse Tolkien's approach by asserting that the things he wrote were more histories than stories per se. With Rowling, that's just not the case. She piles more and more characters into the foreground, but with less and less depth and distinctiveness. She tosses in supposedly huge elements of mythology for this world, but it comes out of nowhere and adds almost nothing, ultimately, to any part of the story. And in the meantime, we're just not drawn into the fight because it has no real context. It feels like it's adrift in an ocean of vague ideas and half-baked concepts without the comparatively rich and evocative, warm, living world that readers experienced in the first couple of books. Touching back on the Tolkien comparison, and Rowling herself holds Tolkien and Lewis very highly, it feels more like she was inspired by him at first, keeping Voldemort as an unpleasant memory casting a pall over the wizarding world. Here's the thing, Voldemort, like Sauron, is better never manifesting directly in the story if this is the story we're going to tell. Even the Necromancer is handled like this. The Necromancer is a guise that Sauron took during the time of Bilbo Baggins' adventures with the dwarves. In the book, at least, the Necromancer never interacts directly with Bilbo or any of the main characters, and is only defined by the repercussions of his actions and what is said about him, similarly to Sauron in Lord of the Rings. If you want to read about Sauron in the Second Age or Melkor earlier than him, that's a completely different tone and different narrative. Sauron during The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings is a legacy, a haunting, a possession really in every sense of the term. The story of Voldemort is largely incoherent and confusing by the time we actually pick it up. The concept of Tom Riddle becoming Voldemort through the years is a straightforward progression that is nonetheless made extremely arcane by dealing with it so poorly. Riddle's diary is shoehorned into the story, but it doesn't make sense most of the time it's touched upon because it's also remarkably irrelevant except when it's forced into events. Allow me to illustrate with this conversation between two people voiced only by me. "Oh, hello, Gregory, and how are you today?" "I'm quite well, Vicky, and it's nice weather out." "Yes, it is. Say, can you help me figure out where the Chamber of Secrets is?" "I certainly can. And just incidentally, do you remember that Tom Riddle chap in the house where all of his family were suspiciously murdered at once? I wonder whatever happened to him, especially after a long series of mysterious deaths surrounded him and he just disappeared." "Well, that's awfully specific, and I didn't really expect you to be able to help me. It seems a tremendous coincidence." "Vicky, do you remember the First Wizarding War? 'Cause I don't remember that at all, but I remember the plot to Wizard Amityville." It would have been much better in this case in particular to have it be a situation of ghosts still holding weight and having a significant presence in the wizarding world. Again, a haunting, a possession, not the big bad monster actually being there. It's a much better examination of their society by looking at what is important to them, how they carry themselves into the future, and how they deal with the legacies left them by years past. Even Voldemort himself behaves like a completely different character to Tom Riddle, not even feeling like a logical development of the character. He's a hypocritical shit who's terrified of death but happy to bring it to others in the form of being a fucking serial killer. Tom actually had some layers to his motivation, but Voldemort is barely a two-dimensional character, and the Death Eaters are just cartoon cultists. There's no real nuance to their existence, and the ideology they follow is nothing but a perfunctory excuse. It's often the case that bad people constantly search for an ideology to use as an excuse for their bad behavior, and this is no different. The comically simple evil that the Death Eaters promote demonstrates the callow, basic quality of them all, something that destroys characterization that was built up previously rather than bringing it to the next step of development. development. Whereas Lucius Malfoy in Chamber of Secrets was subtle, varied in his interactions with others, and highly intelligent, Lucius Malfoy in Deathly Hallows was a completely stereotypical jackbooted empty-headed buffoon goose-stepping his way into a Daffy Duck cartoon. The problem here is that people behaving badly who espouse a certain philosophy or position, or who attach themselves to a certain movement, do not make that philosophy, position, or movement incorrect or wrong. It means, at most, that it holds appeal for a certain audience and type of person. It is not, and is shown not to be, an unreasonable position to believe that Muggles should be kept ignorant of magic and the existence of a whole world revolving around it. It is not unreasonable to find Muggles dangerous and their tendencies destructive and abhorrent to the grand scheme of the universe. But it is pretty much never presented by anyone who possesses anything approaching rational thought. Muggles are awful, and they would pretty easily destroy the Wizarding World if they knew about it. There are very good and highly valid reasons to dislike, fear, even hate Muggles, and Rowling's attempts at humanizing them, especially through people like the Dursleys, fail spectacularly and just manage to convey the opposite point. If you look at the situation, you must realize that the best Muggles can be expected to do is not fuck with the Wizarding World. That's the best case scenario. But like every optimal, it's extremely unlikely for that to be a universal result. The pureblood question is dog shit, of course. That's where the whole movement and any chance of the villains actually having any personality or good writing behind them vanishes like morning mist. That's where you get the most Nazi parallels, but it's not consistently combined with the supposed catalyst of everything. Voldemort wants to dominate the world and wipe it free from any Muggle danger, but he doesn't present that, nor do his followers interpret it, in any remotely cogent manner. To use a comparison strangely appropriate for this series, it's as stupid as attempting to get rid of gay people by preventing gay people from having children. Yeah, I went there. Take that with your remarkably uninformed post-war fixation. In the Wizarding World, someone can be born of the most mundane nothing parents and yet be a wizard or a witch. In the same way, gay people most often come from two straight parents. It's just idiotic to interpret that the way that the Death Eaters do in the story. They're all about hating Muggles and Muggle-borns, but that's an utterly nonsensical attitude and the exact opposite one they should have. What they should be doing is rescuing, even if only in their own minds, the magical-born children of Muggles, rather than stigmatizing those born of non-magical humans. It's even stated at one point in the books that it's not important what someone is born as, but what they become in their life. To have such a big deal made of that matter in the wrong way at the 11th hour is just ludicrous, and it's a whiplash-gifting twist that probably wasn't intended to be one because it's patently poor writing. Pretty poor that Voldemort and the Death Eaters could have been wiped out if literally anyone put hands on a fucking submachine gun. But let's not address that at all, despite constantly spending huge stretches of time outside the fucking Wizarding World more and more as the series goes on. Maybe it's in the nature of my upbringing, but I find it very difficult indeed to regard London with the same wonder and magic as a literally wondrous magical world completely separate and distinct from the mundane one. But to return to the issue of the Wizarding World, it would have been much more haunting, a lingering malaise that could never fully be removed, to have the mere memory of Voldemort and his legacy be the very thing that Harry Potter fights, simply by the virtue of existing. That could be the great hope invested in Harry by the Wizarding World. It would have been truly uplifting if, rather than the mess we had ended up with, including a very difficult-to-like Harry by the end of it, we had Harry Potter as the beacon of hope for the future, the boy who lived and in so doing finally cleared a break in the storm. I'm just going to be plain here and say that if Rowling wanted to write about a direct conflict with Voldemort, James Potter and his friends and companions had a much, much more compelling story to tell. We see quite a lot of it in flashback, telling to others and so forth, but if Rowling really wanted to write a story where young wizards advance through school and then eventually have to fight the big bad guy who's the Emperor of Darkness or whatever, James would have been a better protagonist in pretty much every way. I also feel that, and this is perhaps because these stories aren't the focus and only appear on reflection, the characters involved are generally much more sympathetic and likable. Part of it would be their youth and inexperience tempting forgiveness for wrongdoing, but the primary characters of James' story are on the whole much more likable than Harry or the main assembly of people he calls friends. There are also far fewer characters introduced in these flashback stories, understandably, but if the stories maintain that economy of characters, it could only benefit matters. Wouldn't it have been nice to see the relationships between characters develop, and maybe someone actually relevant to the story being retroactively put on the gay train? As usual, the female characters will probably be the worst of all, but Lily being a perfect angel who pulls perfect angel bullshit out of her ass as a party piece is at least tolerable, if also contemptible. The First Wizarding War lasted an extremely implausible 11 years, which just happens to be the typical age where young magic users start attending magic school, and, of course, is Harry's age when his story begins. Still, even if it were drawn out to last half that time, it could still fill numerous books with plenty of individual adventures, and the great part would be that it would actually have a focus from start to finish. That's more than can be said for Harry's time in the future. I would just recommend changing the ending a bit and, not murdering your main characters horribly for no good goddamn reason. Which leads neatly into this point, and it's one that can not only be applied to Harry Potter, but the rest of all writing ever. It is this: killing off characters to raise the stakes is puerile and ruins the story, especially if the characters being written out are far superior to the ones the author wants us to be interested in or invested in. As well as that, torturing them or savaging them before you kill them off makes the affair even more distasteful and the technique tacky and unwelcome, and Rowling is terribly prone to that. I've said it before and I'll say it again. In fiction, if a character must fall, it should be their finest hour, the one great last stand before they are gone. Something to remember them by, and something that matters. No death should ever be needless or insignificant in fiction. Pointless, useless death is nothing but shock tactics at best and childish prattle most of the rest of the time. And it's another thing to remember, and one which every would-be writer would do to note, that death is not a valid motivator. If someone has to die for your heroes to finally get off their asses and do something, they're not very good heroes, or people in general for that matter. Someone should not have to die in order to motivate people to act who should have been moving long before that. Plus, it's not like there are no other options. Honestly, extreme inconvenience is something that most people grow to strongly dislike and try to avoid, but if you want to go the easy way, just have someone in danger of injury. If a character dies, that's the end of the drama you can get from it. It's done. There's lingering trauma that no author ever remembers to write unless it's the story's focus or a plot device, and that character doesn't tend to contribute any further to the plot. So you're essentially limiting yourself more every time you do it. And another thing I've said before, and still hold to, is that every character is someone's favorite. If you get rid of that character forever, you will tend to lose that person as a fan. It's very hard to maintain any level of enthusiasm for a story when your favorite part is gone and won't be back. This may not matter to some writers, but it should be right at the front of anyone's mind who intends to write for broader audiences. Additionally, taking affectations as if you had no control over the story is immensely pretentious and absolutely undeserving of pity. If you are the author, you can write whatever story you want. If you can't, then how can you accept praise of a story you didn't write but instead was written through you? What I'm saying is, don't try to sell your sob story about how you cried killing off a character you claim you didn't want to. Nobody feels sorry for you. You're the author and you can make a story go however you choose. To quote a great witch, your tasteful modesty is out of fashion, so knock it off. In any case, perhaps the absolute worst, the moment where the shark glanced up and saw a motorcycle with a half-giant on it, is when Snape killed Dumbledore. It was embarrassingly bad, a completely cringe-worthy direction to take, and it just heaped one "it's not a phase, Mom" pile of teen angst on top of the other. Not only did the circumstances not make sense, which is related to the magic being an incoherent mess, but more on that later, but the way things were set up led to nothing but wholesale character destruction. Of course, Snape was one of the characters demolished in this, but that's not a shock because he's an asshole and Rowling is not especially gifted in nuance. It is definitely the moment when Snape crosses the line into irredeemability, but that flies right past the realization that it's also the moment when Dumbledore becomes completely unsympathetic. If we accept the poor storytelling that makes that situation even possible, Dumbledore is being slowly destroyed by a curse. I'm not going to get into the details because frankly the whole affair is utterly asinine, needlessly and endlessly complicated, and doesn't make any practical sense. That's what wikis are for. Anyway, Dumbledore decides to conspire with Snape, whom he's planned as a double agent to undermine the Death Eaters from within, And that much makes enough sense. You could believe that, and in the hands of a more skilled writer, we could have had a Snape with levels and complexity, who wasn't just a dickhole and should never have gone into teaching, but instead a flawed but ultimately well-intentioned and very intelligent man. But to hell with that, Dumbledore decides to basically manipulate Snape into killing him, supposedly to save Draco from the guilt that would cause his soul, or something. It's just another aspect of the unbelievably inconsistent cosmology of the Harry Potter universe. Is it religious quackery? Is it an established fact and scientific study? Who knows? Things only come up when they're relevant, and then they're typically discarded and forgotten about. The thing that makes this such a terrible act, aside from the obvious act of murder here, is that it didn't even have to happen like it did. Surely they could have arranged it to seem like Snape tricked him or manipulated him into letting it happen. He was cursed after all, and it was just delaying the inevitable. What would it matter how it even happened? Who was going to bust Snape's balls over accomplishing the murder of one of the most powerful wizards in the world? Wouldn't it be more tragic anyway for a gentle yet unavoidable end? But it was a whole big fucking drama scene, which was bad enough, especially since he pitched himself off a fucking tower. It's amazing they could scrape together enough for a funeral. But then you added to that the fact that he didn't even tell Harry about it. So thanks a lot, Dumbledore. You've now heaped even more trauma and guilt on someone surrounded by more than his share. It's important to note here, too, that things like that can actually kill people. And even if it might not at that time, lingering trauma, stress, and grief can kill people over time. And I haven't even mentioned Draco yet. Sure, he's there. He's part of this crew that Voldemort has sent to carry out his hit, but that's really not okay. Not that any of the abuse heaped onto Draco was acceptable, but that especially showed that Dumbledore, who should have been the pinnacle of goodness and strength, was extremely inconsiderate at best, and that's being very generous and forgiving indeed. Those things aside, even if you don't want to consider the feelings or health of any of these young people who have been drawn into a conflict allowed to reach ridiculous levels, a conflict which I add was not their own but an older generation dumped onto their shoulders, there's simply no way Snape and Dumbledore could have planned for any and all of the things that happened because of them doing what they did the way they did. In doing that, in causing the extreme trauma to Harry, at the very least, they made it more likely that something would go in a way that simply no one could ever expect. It really depends on a whole lot of extremely unlikely coincidences and things just happen into place, which only damages the integrity of the narrative. If Dumbledore had been cursed and fell into a deep sleep from which no one seemed able to wake him, that still would have been something that could have been used in a much less unpredictable way, and unlike killing a character off, it could have actually motivated the hero to defeat the villain in order to find a way to wake Dumbledore up. And if you wanted to, you could leave it open. Dumbledore could be out for several books, and it could be an ongoing concern that he may never be back. There you go, 5 seconds of thinking, and that's only one of surely countless superior ways that could have been handled. The same can be said for every other instance in the entire series. It's especially noteworthy that the villainous wizard obsessed with contingency plans and fail-safes and backups only decides to put all his eggs in one basket because the writer decided to abandon consistency in favor of generating drama for herself. And every other instance tends to come off as much the same. Quite frankly, though, this is a problem that crops up in the rest of the series, and it seems to reflect a stunning lack of consideration for any other person in the world. It keeps happening that no one tells anyone else anything, regardless of how important it might be and how much trouble it would save them going to after the situation inevitably spirals out of control. Probably 90% of all problems in Harry Potter's life could be, if not avoided, then at least dealt with better and in a healthier way, if only people in the wizarding world had even basic communication skills, or if they respected each other enough to share a confidence, or if they bothered to share information during the execution of a very fragile plan. And if it's not that, then it's characters like Hermione, who really is the absolute worst at times. She never seems to do much of anything unless there's no real cost for her, unless she happens to just feel like it at the time. She even helps Ron cheat at Quidditch, which, I will add, puts lives in danger by the very nature of Quidditch as presented in the films, and for an extremely frivolous reason. Her finest hour is literally waiting until after the last minute, then pulling a deus ex machina out of her ass that essentially gives her the cheat code to win. And these are things that could go in any direction, but the fact that they don't only makes these problems seem pretty insignificant and like they could have been relatively easily avoided or resolved favorably, if only anyone bothered to put any effort at all into it at the time. She later tries to claim that being complicit in planned destruction of school property frees her of any blame because she's mad with the power of being a prefect and doesn't want to not be a prefect, even though by that time nothing means anything at school anymore, and going along with it is an exercise not only in pointlessness, but in actively supporting the meaningless charade. Good job, Hermione. People have started to notice in recent years how every time Rowling revisits Harry and his contemporaries, it damages the characters and setting more. What they don't seem to realize is that it was pretty flawed from the start. It's often hard to look past the window of nostalgia, especially if you were able to get through a difficult time by escaping through your imagination into this other world. It's easy to see when the whole thing started to turn as a whole, and that's during The Prisoner of Azkaban. Though that was unquestionably the best of the books, it still relied on a devastating deus ex machina which, as previously noted, massively cheapened the whole series of conflicts in it. However, as it was still fun magic school adventures, again, consistency in tone is important, that wasn't so crucial as it became almost immediately after. Draco's brattiness really comes to the fore here, but that's nothing altogether new or different. He's just a bully, perhaps with issues of his own that will be more explored later. Business as usual. His father, however, abusing his influence is troubling. Even more troubling is the ease with which Malfoy the Elder gets things done, and it casts many shadows over the government of this wondrous-seeming world that may not be so wondrous throughout. And you can tell that's right where Rowling's imagination begins to snowball and spitball all at the same time. Consequently, Goblet of Fire really and truly was a patchwork abomination. Its tone was all over the place, and the stakes were raised with chaos at a very public sports match, eyewitness reports of very troubling things, and a remarkable degree of utter inaction, made even more remarkable by what we find out later, which was very obviously not planned from this earlier stage. But the long and short of the matter is that the Goblet of Fire should never have happened the way it did, and the reason for that is the existence of the Time Turner. It makes zero sense that Harry would not have immediately got one as soon as possible and used it to undo the things that had happened, which were ridiculous to begin with. So you expect readers to believe that Voldemort, who fills at minimum 5 more books and 6 more films with various backup plans and failsafes, decides, hey, why don't I just put all my eggs in one basket? But on that note, I, unfortunately, will have to address the stage flop that nobody enjoyed, The Cursed Child. Giving off vibes of Rowling wanting to do Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, it managed to demonstrate instead that some authors should never revisit stories they have finished, no matter how bad a job they did, or how much some fans just want more. The Cursed Child didn't work as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, largely because it's not funny or witty, and the character at stake here is a hero and beloved. Whereas the protagonists are so stupid, they can be considered mentally disabled. But it handily makes everyone look like an idiot, most of all Rowling herself, for thinking that she could actually address a problem she created and forgot about by writing a story that clearly pointed out how wrong she was in every single Harry Potter book after The Prisoner of Azkaban. It's a last peek into Harry Potter's world that overstays its welcome and makes people feel stupid, for good reason, forever loving it. They desperately tried to sensationalize stunt casting too, which was met with a large-scale whatever, and the whole affair was a failure because it frankly wasn't any bloody good. Dealing with the Time Turner was similarly a complete failure. Anyone with the slightest capacity for rational thought will come up with no end of questions, problems, and inconsistencies unanswered by Rowling's narrative. There is no logical reason at all why Harry wouldn't have just used the Time Turner to go back in time and fix the very avoidable situation at the end of Goblet of Fire. Having that be done later doesn't make sense. Why wait? It's not like there was some forbidden seal or something on time travel. There should have been, and here's yet another 5 seconds of thought solving a major problem with the story, but there wasn't. Hermione borrowed a gadget from her professor just for shits and giggles, essentially, to give herself a frankly unfair advantage in her studies by attending extra classes. And speaking practically, the Time Turners had to be pretty common, or at least not particularly rare. There was even one specifically stated to have been left in the Room of Requirement. This gives a clear picture of Time Turners being like virtually any collectible, like a limited-run statuette, a a commemorative plate, or even a comic book. There are undoubtedly thousands or more of the things, and for someone to have left one around casually, disregarded and not immediately snapped up by anyone for themselves, or to sell it, really kind of drives the point home that they're not really that special. But that was kind of part of the entire point of the Time Turner and Prisoner of Azkaban. It was not a huge big deal to go back in time. It was reacted to like an extra apple with lunch. They were able to apply it carefully to exactly what they wanted, and they did take care to do that, but it was not an especially difficult thing that they did. Freeing Buckbeak and Sirius Black and facing Dementors and saving Harry's life, those were much more difficult because they required actual planning and subtlety. Not that any of it was played as being particularly hard, though, and it does raise questions about why they didn't just put forth the effort when the events were happening, but you can hand-wave it. Like I said, Magic School Adventures, I can forgive that. I can't forgive it in the subsequent story trying a little too hard to be serious business. Every time they do not use the Time Turner after the affair with Sirius Black is a plot hole and a huge narrative failure. But as one last touch upon the stage abomination, the whole premise is utterly dysfunctional and nonsensical. It is undignified to the point of being embarrassing, and it really only serves to give its audience the equivalent of blue balls, while at the same time disgracing a character who never did any wrong. It's especially execrable that it conveys the impression that because a change in time altered reality, this is somehow a reflection that the characters changed were bad. Even the most basic awareness of the concept completely defeats that. If changing any part of the timeline leads to a different reality, then there are infinite timelines. You can no more depend on someone to be the same person than you can to expect to be able to reset the timeline if you fuck it up. People change over time, and there are infinite possible timelines to progress. This is often reflected in fiction, especially superhero-related genre, by infinite parallel worlds. Even Dark Shadows examined parallel time and alternate dimensions, and it was exciting to the audience because the characters they thought they knew were often drastically different. But this also reflected that those weren't the people they knew, because it was another universe. This was made very clear by the final main storyline in conventional time of Dark Shadows. If I may take a moment to look back at the early 1970s and a pioneering television series, a trip to parallel time ended up depositing Barnabas and Julia, the main heroes of the narrative, in the then far-flung future of 1995. They arrived after the destruction of their home, Collinwood, and met some people they knew, but much older and very different. It was a mystery for them to figure out not only how to get back to their appropriate time, but furthermore how to avert the disaster that took place while they were away. I won't go on about that storyline because, while it was very compelling to a fan of the show, I shouldn't complicate the point further. The point is that the drive behind a time travel story usually lies in changing time. There's no point in doing such a story if the ultimate resolution is failing to change anything. It's not compelling. It only surprises once and doesn't lend itself well to repeated viewings or readings, and it's the kind of trick you cannot and must not repeat. It's especially pointless when you're introduced to characters you aren't familiar with and don't care about, so the ones you know, the ones you're hoping will be saved by preventing the disaster that is history in the future time, are the only ones you have any stakes in, and then it gives you nothing and excuses it with a transparent and flimsy justification. Which is of course that, oh my goodness, how horrible, in this one timeline that somebody else interfered with and didn't take its natural course as before, the character is allied with the bad guys. Oh, how terrible. Certainly none of them could have been good. We certainly won't see Draco at the end of the series like nothing fucking happened because he's popular with the audience. An altered timeline with heavy tampering from the evil side of things obviously means that anyone on their side was just waiting for the right moment to show their true wicked personalities. Except that's a load of dog shit. And anyone who gives it even 30 seconds consideration will come to the same conclusion. Even one of the greatest and best-known tropes of parallel timelines is the evil other-dimensional counterpart, usually with some kind of unfortunate facial hair. It doesn't mean that our Spock is evil just because alternate world Spock is. It doesn't mean our Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart is a fascist just because alternate world Brigade Leader Lethbridge Stewart is. That's supposed to be used as a subversion of the audience's assumptions, to make something that would otherwise be a familiar comfort become nothing of the sort. In many ways, this is one of the most effective methods to make an alternate timeline seem alien and unsettling. But the audience shouldn't make that leap of illogic, and neither should the author. Just because there's a possibility of something happening doesn't make it likely. If the probability of it happening is infinitesimal, then it's scientifically negligible, and thus unreasonable and illogical. In short, you can't impugn a person's character because of a tiny possibility reflected by one of an infinite number of possibilities. That would be as stupid as saying that because there's an alternate universe where Captain Britain is a Nazi, Captain Britain in the main universe is one. That's just asinine. The story really takes a dive after The Prisoner of Azkaban. Honestly, if Rowling wanted to continue as she did, she probably should have just ended the story with Order of the Phoenix, if anywhere. But it was immensely unsatisfying because the main characters, the students, Harry and his peers, never are allowed to accomplish anything on their own with any plan. Things fall into place and then someone else accomplishes something that momentarily moves the plot. The only agency any character has is to leave the story, which Fred and George do. Harry and his friends are otherwise rendered essentially passengers in their own story. Even the Order itself is worthless. They established the goddamn thing to stop Voldemort and maintained it in case he returned, but apparently took absolutely no measures to ensure this, so when Voldemort does return, for the third time in less than 5 years, publicly and explicitly, the Order are all thrown under the plot bus as much as Harry and his friends. Everyone is stymied from being effective because, presumably for some reason, Rowling thought she had a better idea. She did not. It's especially irritating and very telling that she still did not have a solid idea of the story progressing, that Voldemort in this is seen openly by multiple people in the Ministry, yet for some reason the nonsensical bullshit that follows happens anyway. It's an actual fact that pointless angst and death in books for young readers tends to get awards, even if absolutely nobody actually enjoys the story. It's a stupid fact, and one that says a whole lot about the utter pretentiousness of authors, as well as the lack of respect for young readers that exists in the industry. There is, in Harry Potter, a pointless fascination with mortality. But we also have remarkably well-adjusted ghosts, a completely pleasant, painless death spell, and a portal straight to the afterlife. If you're going to try and deal with death, it's pretty meaningless if you won't really commit to it. And you really can't with those things existing and constantly interacting with the living world. But Rowling tries anyway, by casually offing characters more and more as the series goes on. She'd claim that the change in tone and her attitude was to grow up with the reader, which is a blatant lie in no small part because the books are vastly more puerile as they go. Why not create a spin-off for older readers if you genuinely want to provide something for them rather than completely changing the tone in huge parts of the setting? Yet again, the series could have continued indefinitely. In fact, the 2 series could have continued indefinitely. One could be more oriented towards younger readers and concentrate on magic school fun adventures, whereas the other one could be perhaps darker, more serious, and deal with things like loss, corruption, and political commentary. As it is, the series is about as consistent as if Lucy from Peanuts went on a murder spree that the story played deadly serious. The Prisoner of Azkaban could have, and probably should have, been a good jumping-off point into the more serious business series for older readers. And in killing off characters, it is almost always, across the board, a bad idea to craft a character who could contribute considerably more to the story and then get rid of them. It's an amateurish tactic to build up a character into being charming, useful, and a positive presence, and then get rid of them so the audience will think, oh, they could have contributed more, it's like a life being abruptly cut off. But that's a cheap tactic of manipulative nonsense, and if one thinks about it even for a moment, very obviously just bad writing. If a character can contribute more to the story and is built up to do exactly that, don't get rid of them, especially when the characters left in the narrative never get around to actually contributing more to the story. If you're putting forth the effort to develop the characters, you really shouldn't get rid of them, especially if you're not a particularly skilled writer. You can't afford to lose characters that are actually well-liked, capable, and have something further to contribute. At the very least, they can help to move the plot, unlike the majority of the characters introduced anywhere, but especially in the last few books, in the story of Harry Potter. And back to the concept of death coloring the narrative, the Deathly Hallows are pointless and meaningless and a really obvious retcon. The whole thing about Master of Death means accepting one's mortality is idiotic and insulting. There's a whole fixation with death, a borderline obsession, and it's just not helpful. It will not help young readers understand or deal with it anymore. It's not good for the narrative. and it contributes little, if anything, to the story. And if you're that obsessed with it, you're certainly not accepting it or not worrying about it. You don't have to fear death just to not like it or want it. It's a very facile way to look at the issue that doesn't allow for the slightest complexity or depth. It's pretentious, pointless, and frustrating, and it's the kind of aside that derails the story. Killing off Dobby, for example, was so utterly extra that it was laughably ridiculous, but played for huge melodrama. Lupin being written out of the story was such a completely pointless afterthought that the Lego game played it as a joke that he had somehow become a ghost since appearing just earlier, and I couldn't help but kind of chuckle at it because it really was a ridiculous half-assed move that deserved to be made the butt of a joke. And pretty much all the other instances are just as bad. They don't help things. And they're even made worse in adaptation, like when Sirius Black gets double killed in the film instead of just conveniently throwing himself into the afterlife after being hit by a spell that shouldn't really have done that in the books. I understand the need for some artists to try and put their pain and sorrow into their work so they can deal with it by creating, but I am just going to say this and let everyone rave about the Emperor's avant-garde fashions to me afterwards. Here it is. Deal with it in your own way, and don't write a story meant for mass consumption where you toss it in to teach a hard lesson. It will largely either not be understood by anyone but you, people won't be able to comprehend or connect to it, or it will be pointless in the long line of pretentious writers trying to win awards by dealing with hard lessons. Fuck off. I was sick of that shit by age 8. Snape, Draco, and the entire Slytherin house are never really developed or given any levels beyond what they have when we first meet them. If anything, Snape becomes less sympathetic and less interesting as the story goes on, and by the time he finally leaves the story, it's impossible to give two shits about him. Alan Rickman's brilliant performance was the only thing that actually salvaged the character to any extent in the films. And even there, he can't save an absolutely irredeemably horrible, or if we're kind, stupid character. He's not a hero. He's not even an anti-hero. These sorts of characters use ingenuity and their integral strength to resolve dire situations. That's where the tension typically comes from when such a character is placed into a challenging circumstance. But Snape, unfortunately for himself in the story, only ever fails in every significant challenge he is presented with. He is utterly brutal to anyone he regards as incapable, whatever the reason, so he's tremendously hypocritical too, because once his own ineptitude results in people dying, he has achieved utter incompetence beyond any poor potion student. There's nothing to redeem him, only to further condemn him, which seems to be something else that Rowling has missed. She seems to think she was writing a flawed but noble man, when what she was writing was in fact a broken person not even sympathetic for trying to do good and failing. He clearly didn't have the mental fortitude or intelligence to think of anything cleverer than what other people told him would be the smart thing to do. It was, in fact, not the smart thing to do. When Snape allows one of his friends and fellow teachers to be murdered by Voldemort, this especially shows how Rowling failed to make him any kind of admirable person. We're supposed to believe that he stayed silent and didn't help her because if he had, Voldemort would have killed him or become suspicious. But that doesn't make any sense at all. Voldemort is a cartoon villain playing it slightly broader than Snidely Whiplash, but he's not a total idiot, which he'd have to be if he had killed Snape for saying, "Hey, maybe don't murder that woman I know." They were acquainted with each other. Of course you shouldn't announce your intentions to murder someone's acquaintances in front of them and expect them to be cool with that. Of course they wouldn't be cool with that. But more than that, Snape killed Dumbledore. What, did Voldemort, with all his knowledge of death and obsession avoiding it, suspect that this somehow was an elaborate ruse, where Dumbledore was going to do what he never could and rise from the dead on his own power? Because the books made it very clear that Voldemort probably would have figured that out himself if anyone were going to at that period of time. Regardless, Snape more than proved his loyalty and dedication by committing murder for Voldemort of one of his most powerful enemies. If he wasn't convinced by that, he's an idiot, and that demolishes any presence or impact the character has as a villain. And this one's even more moronic to suspect because Snape was Dumbledore's employee and friend. Even if people believe in an evil organization's tenets, they are still human beings and still have interpersonal relationships between them. Snape having to prove himself beyond this is an artificial storytelling obstacle, and it makes Dumbledore's death meaningless and Voldemort and his ilk flat nothing characters. They don't have any real reason to do the things they're doing. They're just evil. It's remarkable how much that completely devalues it, down to the very concept of evil. And that's some impressive villain that can't even stand up to a child. He'll murder at the drop of a hat, but he can't manage to kill a kid. At multiple points, he completely invisibly infiltrates Hogwarts for lengthy stretches of time. And he couldn't have just poisoned him in that time, killed him in his bed, taken him by surprise in the bathroom? Was Polyjuice beyond his abilities somehow? Or was he just unwilling to disguise himself as someone else to kill Harry? Sure, it wouldn't have been the most impressive victory, but with someone like how Voldemort is written in the books, it shouldn't matter. The important thing for a person like we have been told he is to kill. That's his solution for everything, unless for some reason it isn't. The murder Snape utterly fails to prevent is just such a pointless act that adds nothing, technically or functionally, to the story. Even on its surface, it's pointless and meaningless, but furthermore, it's tacky. It's inappropriate for the audience and the tone. It's creepy and would suit a horror narrative much more effectively, because there it would actually serve some purpose. Here it does nothing but demolish one character, dispense with another, and make a third and all his cohorts look less competent, less formidable, and impressively like the villain from an unfortunate and not very skillful rip-off of James Bond. Since the murdered character never comes up again to any degree and is never avenged, nor is the death used to motivate another character, yes, I know I already said it was bad writing and a fuck-up, and I maintain that, it is a useless addition to an already bloated story with volumes of irrelevant nothing. It does not add to any character or build them up. It only takes away and continues to take away from everyone who participated in that scene. That is the opposite of what writing should do. Really, most all of the characters are pretty awful people, but it's the one Rowling clearly likes whom we are also supposed to like. It's facile like that. The problem with this is that virtually every character is exactly who we think they are 5 seconds after meeting them, and this never actually changes. Despite things happening and them presumably evolving as people, they never really get around to doing any such thing. We're supposed to be instantly attached to characters who never have to actually justify that attachment or provide any real means for it, just as we're supposed to immediately and perpetually despise the ones Rowling has set up for such things. The truth is that she had about one special thing for every character to do, one role for them to fill in the story, and most of them never moved beyond that. Remarkably, Ron is the perfect example of this, despite being a prominent main-focused character. He's good at chess, which becomes relevant in the first story. He contributes almost nothing at all to the story after that. That is his one moment. He peaks in the very first story. After that, he's either an accessory to Scabbers, or toxic twerp heaping abuse onto girls. He exists only to make Harry look better and more capable because by comparison Ron is inferior in every way. Poor Neville is about the same. He gets to do nothing until the very end of the story, which is a role anyone else could have functionally filled. There was some speculation that Neville was actually the hero of the books, and Rowling was being very clever at misdirecting the audience at Harry, and then she wrote the last few books in the series and managed to show instead that she really was just an inept writer attempting to seem much cleverer and much more nuance-minded than she really was. The only thing Neville gets to take away from his participation in the story is permanent trauma. Neville is developed to a point more than most of the other primarily background characters, but it's just abuse heaped onto him and his family. It's really appalling if one looks at it just how he's treated, and all in the name of character development, which doesn't develop a thing. Like Ron, who is arguably a much more prominent character in the story, Neville gets to do one significant thing and spends the entire rest of the time as the butt of jokes or essentially wallpaper. Neville might as well be Justin Finch-Fletchley, whom I expect LEGO Harry Potter fans will recognize as one of the first other students you unlock in the course of the game. But he, like Neville and really Ron and anyone else, has one thing that he does, one role he fulfills in the story, and nothing more. Sure, his is being petrified by the basilisk, but really is that any less impressive than having chess expertise be relevant once, or performing a significant act once that most anyone else could have done? The only reason anyone ever thought that the villains were multifaceted or not really evil or bad people is because it's so basic that readers assumed surely that wasn't it, and surely the author had a plan to either redeem or somewhat explain why they're doing what they're doing. But that was it. That was all. Snape is a heel from the start, and readers dislike him, so he never really is redeemed, and despite some good deeds, is ultimately the same in the end as he was when we first met him. By the time Rowling even tries to backbuild a defense for his asshole behavior throughout the whole preceding story, it ends up making it worse, and in any case it's magnificently, almost hilariously, too late. None of the Slytherin house are particularly distinguished or given any sort of redemption arc, or heaven forfend, an arc that shows they're not all a bunch of evil bastards. But then what do you expect from people you shove in a literal dungeon and unite all the other students against? The point of the books to so many people was to celebrate one's individuality and the beauty of not being like everyone else, that everyone had something good and worthwhile about them. So, what about Draco? All he ends up doing is being a two-dimensional bully, and then he's just used by other people until the story ends. He doesn't get any focus, really, and he doesn't develop into anything but the guy who was designed from physical appearance onward to be Harry Potter's polar opposite, which he was from the start. If the bully character had been different in every book, it would have felt the same, because he's essentially a generic placeholder that we ourselves are supposed to fill out in absence of any effort by the storyteller to do so. Somehow he became popular, largely because of the chemistry between him and Harry. He was honestly more popular, not to mention more skillfully developed, in stories that linked the two romantically. He had to be for the story to work. In the books he was, quite plainly, not a threat or a great danger, he was just a pain in the ass. Perhaps the most concerning part is that he shows up in the execrable epilogue. But what the hell are we supposed to think about that? He was working with the Death Eaters. His entire family consisted of fucking Death Eaters. Was he somehow okay with them getting carted off to the renewed Azkaban under a new regime the same as before? Was he really following Voldemort or not? Did he really enlighten himself and adopt more acceptable philosophies, or did they just brainwash or bully him into pretending to do that? The questions are endless, and they only get more concerning as you go. The Ministry is no better than it was before the wars. We can't assume benevolence at all when it's exactly the same environment that fostered fascistic ethno-bigots' rise to power. Twice! I've said it before. I think Dolores Umbridge is one of the best characters in the whole series, but that's not to say I like her at all or think she's a fantastic person. She has such potential, which is what I like to see in stories. There's a lot of the story there, and we actually get to see a tiny amount of it in Order of the Phoenix. She's unfortunately set up as a teen comedy villain, which is to say a largely incompetent but shockingly evil, if you think about it, person that the audience is supposed to hate. And we do, she's absolutely horrible. But she's not at all dealt with well in the course of the story. Umbridge represents everything wrong with the wizarding world, but no one really points this out. She is the complacency and willful ignorance which provided a toxic breeding ground for the Death Eaters' fascism to thrive not once but twice, or possibly 3 times, judging by the disappointing resolution. She is living in a fantasy, which is pretty meta, and insists upon her vision of reality, which is not shared by anyone other than her and absolutely not based on any fact or objective analysis. The major problem with that is that she is someone in whom power is invested, and she can make or influence significant policy decisions that affect everyone. She is a delusional sociopath and governs her life, as well as those people who fall under her influence, by way of her delusions. To anyone with the capacity for rational thought, this is horrific. No one really takes a concerted stand against her either, which is absolutely baffling since, as capable as she might be implied to be, she never actually demonstrates it. She's a violent, hateful, willfully ignorant twat, and the beauty of that is that young readers exposed to Umbridge through the story will recognize the army of her that makes up such a chunk of society. It's the worst possible thing a person can be, and in Umbridge is all the criticism of a corrupt government the story really needs. But the way to deal with problems like that is not to enable or empower them. Treat them like the overblown buffoons they are. Stop feeding their egos. Or just gang up on them. There's no way even a skilled wizard can beat an advantage of numbers or, maybe a gun, as I pointed out earlier. Or good grief, even a frying pan to the head. It's not that hard. Yeah, that really doesn't come off as magical, but neither does the story as it is or the way it's handled. A story that has become prosaic has lost its wonder and does not employ magic anyway. So much in the story could have been solved, or at least made less terrible, by people just telling most of the villains to fuck off and stop wasting their time. And yes, I'm aware of potential consequences, but they can only go so far or the setting becomes completely wrecked even more than it actually was. Even Umbridge would have to hold herself back if one of the students told her to fuck off and then said, "What are you going to do, kill me?" I'll add here that Umbridge did not see herself as evil, wrong, or bad. As far as she was concerned, what she was doing was right and good. She excused her actions when she had any remote rationality, but her problem tended to lie more in her inability to keep her temper and composure, and her tendency to drastically escalate matters far out of proportion. Fred and George proved that Umbridge, the worst problem the characters face other than Voldemort himself, at least structurally, is remarkably irrelevant and utterly impotent. And don't claim it's a British thing, because it's not. Those World War II parallels are not skillfully drawn, and in any case they don't really apply. Britons can be phenomenally resentful and spiteful, and they're every bit as likely to knock an asshole's block off, especially a Nazi, as any American would. There's a tremendous reliance on shorthand, but that only works if it's developed beyond that foundation. Shorthand is fine for a basis, but you have to do something with it. You can't just have placeholders as the foundation of a major element of your setting. The characters organizing to meet in secret and defy the very obviously illegitimate administration is a decent start, but it's not a solution to the problem. And when Umbridge is literally putting people in hospital and nearly killing them, as well as having people mind-raped and exploited, and additionally assembling and mobilizing lynch mobs she is empowered to commit murder if it's deemed necessary, there's kind of a line crossed there. So the painless death spell is forbidden, but the mind-rape spell isn't? Just one bit out of a vast number of issues with Umbridge getting away with literally premeditating murder, violence against children, criminal negligence, emotional abuse, inciting assault, making decisions that were not hers to make, defacing school property, theft, rape, and the list goes on. And oh yes, I'm counting mind rape as rape. You just try to convince me that there's nothing violating about going into someone's memories and thoughts and ripping them apart. The thing is, either it has to be something dealt with using teen hijinks, or it has to be something dealt with using bureaucracy and the legal method. The plain of it is that she should simply have been defied and defeated by the faculty and students coming together. The events of the book should never have happened in the first place and make absolutely no sense, but if they had to occur, that would have been a far better message to present and a far more compelling story. The characters coming together to fight something more real-world to them than some weird Dark Lord that menaced their parents would actually be a great coming-of-age event that could let the characters take the torch passed to them, rather than just being the aforementioned passengers in their own story. This could have ended the problems indicated in the Wizarding World's government, which were introduced in The Prisoner of Azkaban. It would have given Umbridge some meaning. There are a couple of other possibilities. Either have her brought to justice and redeemed, and thus be a symbol that the troubled government is not beyond saving, or have her abuse her power as she did, then find herself facing consequences in the world outside of where she has any influence. It's also a bit curious that despite Rowling's obsession with death, she saves Umbridge from a number of suitably unpleasant ends. Umbridge is the kind of villain that really does need to be done away with at the end of her story, one of the very few instances where death is actually called for, because that sort of villain represents an incarnation of the larger problem. It's like the series Buffy the Vampire Slayer sometimes did. They made real-life problems into monsters that could be defeated. That brings the arc to a satisfying conclusion and resolves the issue. But what Rowling does is have Umbridge get in far over her head in a situation where her political pull is meaningless, teaching a valuable lesson. The way she uses this social power is like a weapon, but to those outside that society, it is nothing at all. Umbridge should never be seen again after being taken off by the centaurs, only whispered as a cautionary tale. But Rowling jumps to the other story, the mashup of which damages both of the main narratives, and then has Umbridge pop up in the end looking disheveled. So you make a big deal out of killing off characters, but you won't do it when the story actually fucking calls for it? And no, Umbridge contributes nothing else to the story. She had no further potential, and that much is made clear when she inexplicably appears later, as if nothing had ever really happened. She's still politically connected and doesn't even appear to have been so much as disciplined in any way at all. Sure, Voldemort united his followers and whatnot, but Umbridge committed multiple serious crimes during her attempt to take over Hogwarts, which was more successful than any other attempt to that point. Certainly, they should have been opposed and prevented, and it's completely intolerable that she managed to accomplish more than one thing. One would think that after the first massive disaster endangering people's lives, especially the lives of hundreds of children, people would quickly and decisively come together and put their collective foot down. But Umbridge is not the only problem character in the story as far as development. Dumbledore, who is often regarded as kindly and beneficent, is objectively a terrible headmaster and only ever does anything the moment after it's too fucking late. He regularly manipulates people into doing things that are far too dangerous, which they should not be doing, and enables by inaction the very situation Harry and his friends have to resolve. One can only imagine that if Dumbledore hadn't somehow been cursed and insisted on being murdered, because he's a huge great goddamn drama queen, he still wouldn't have thought to do anything about Voldemort until he'd destroyed Hogwarts and eaten Harry. Cormac McLaggen and Zachariah Smith are so similar that they might as well be the same person, and they're both only characters we're supposed to dislike because they dare question Harry and aren't 100% behind his, at the time, bitchy ass. But like a lot of characters the audience is supposed to dislike in poorly written stories, they're often the ones that say things others are thinking but don't dare speak. Most of the time these characters are ones that act more realistically, such as having any sense of self-preservation whatsoever. We're supposed to regard them as horrible people because they don't want to possibly give their lives for absolutely one of the worst schools in the universe. Yeah, okay, what cowards? Why wouldn't you want to be horribly murdered in full warfare for a school that doesn't hold your safety as a priority? And no, it never has. But as I said before, I can give it a pass when it's fun magic school adventures. When it becomes serious business, that is no longer possible and no longer fair. In fact, why the hell would they even keep the school going and not send the students home when it's clear they're going to be under attack? There are so many instances of things being kept running that in no way makes sense to keep running. The closest you get is explaining it away like they're doing it out of spite. Ugh, this one's going to be a bit of a monster. Dealing with the system of magic in the wizarding world could fill a whole video. Probably a whole series of videos, so let's just take these one at a time as quickly as possible. First and foremost, the Time Turner. I covered this previously, so I'll just say what a terrible job it does and how it seriously damages every part of the setting to accomplish all the nothing it does. It was never a good idea. You could have just had Harry, Ron, and Hermione actually accomplish something before it was too late, which would have been a much more interesting thing. As the Time Turner is only ever a plot device, regardless of story, it can only be dealt with as such. The Mirror of Erised is a grandly and stupidly named item that a lot is made over for it to be as utterly useless as it is. It's just lame. It, like the Time Turner, is a plot device, but unlike the Time Turner, it's a complete waste of time, and only serves as artificial padding for the already not well-paced story. Ironically, its conflation with the Philosopher's or Sorcerer's Stone only prolongs the inevitable. It's not even a good device for the purpose of illustrating backstory or exploring a character's personality, and it's just desire backwards anyway, fuck's sake. The Elixir of Life can somehow regrow a body for a spirit without one, but still lets its living users age extremely, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Fiendfire. A spell that can destroy Horcruxes but wasn't used because it was difficult to control. This is like Gandalf's claim that Tom Bombadil, despite being completely immune to the effects of the ring, wouldn't understand why they needed to destroy it, so they shouldn't try to ask him. People died as a result of not fucking trying everything. Surely there was a way to limit the effect of the Fiendfire. Fire can be controlled, even without magic. With it, surely, you could at least try the one option you know has an actual chance to solve the whole major problem, instead of trying on potentially cursed items. Has Rowling never heard of Dungeons & Dragons? That is a completely noob-level mistake, and though Albus Dumbledore may be many things, noob is not one of them. And tangentially, if Horcruxes are so damage-resistant to the point of being nigh indestructible items except by high-level magic or artifacts, then how were artifacts so easily corrupted? But, you ask, how can I claim they were easily corrupted if the story tries to claim otherwise? It's easy, I answer, because, among other things corrupted, the key items of the founders of Hogwarts, superlative mages all, were among Voldemort's Horcruxes. These things should have been able to stand up to incredible levels of magic, exactly the power needed to defeat a Horcrux. It took unbelievably powerful things to destroy them, so how exactly was their very nature so twisted? I could believe maybe one of them, perhaps Salazar Slytherins, because of a compatibility in their natures we were supposed to deduce. But most of the Horcruxes? No. What we know about them is also stupid. Sacrificial love can defeat a Horcrux? Bullshit. And you make a Horcrux by performing some horrible act after murdering someone, which is supposedly the most evil act a person can do? Again, bullshit. Also, if killing someone is the most evil act in the wizarding world, J.K. Rowling herself must be Morgoth. But back to Horcruxes. What a load. They're yet another plot device whose only purpose of existence is to artificially pad out the plot. They're introduced in one of the story's many retcons, and they're yet another thing touching half-assedly upon the concept of a soul. And just like nearly every other time such a thing is discussed in fiction, it's only lazily included and ends up complicating more than it answers. So exactly how many ways are there to extract the soul? It's said that Dementors suck out people's souls, is that true? If so, wouldn't it logically be a short leap from studying Dementors to being able to create phylacteries, thereby indefinitely prolonging life? So many artifacts in Harry Potter's world are just extraneous plot devices. They don't do or contribute anything helpful, they just move the plot from one point to the next until they're destroyed, which is never given the dignity it's due. Instead of having the characters develop from point to point and gradually become more fully fleshed people, we have the characters learn little to nothing as they're forcibly moved along by objects that are promptly then dispensed with, as if they were disposable tissues or something. Like every other such plot device, Horcruxes damage the overall setting by not only their inconsistencies, but the very nature of their existence. And I won't even get into the sticky wicket of temporary Horcruxes and that sort of shenanigans. The Deathly Hallows are exactly the same as any other of these artifacts in the series with the promise of wonder. They should be wondrous, even marvelous or miraculous, but they're just a huge disappointment. It seems exciting, but it's not. It's just disappointing and depressing, and it makes the story look poorly considered and pretentious. And now I come to the point that I'm going to have to spend a moment on, and that is the strong criticism I have for good healing magic in the wizarding world. Chiefly that criticism is this: there ain't none. At least, there's none of any real consistency, and it almost never has a prominent role in the stories. Certainly, there must be physicians, healers in the wizarding world, but their ministrations are, based on what we saw, largely alchemy-related. We never see anyone administer effective first aid with any kind of appropriately used spell. We are never taught a single healing spell in all our time with Harry. Not one. It would be like playing Final Fantasy and never learning Cure. But that neatly segues into my point bringing this up, which is that there isn't a resurrection spell at all, not even one, yet there is a spell that literally just kills someone. Avada Kedavra makes no sense. It supposedly causes immediate painless death, but it's also supposedly dark magic. These two things are not easily reconciled, especially considering that even in the very first book, Nicholas Flamel and his wife make the choice to end their lives. Sure, it's by going off the elixir of life with which they had prolonged their lives, but if you have a painless death spell, that's realistically going to come up a lot in the world. And either you're going to have a right-to-die respecting world where it's not that big a deal, or you're going to have a tremendous amount of either controversy or people just looking the other way. In any case, you certainly wouldn't have that curse as is doing what it does. Why even have magic, which should enable wondrous things that humans are not otherwise able to do, when you don't even do it properly? Most magic in Harry Potter's world is almost wholly just things you could do otherwise. The only noteworthy magic items are Deus Ex Machina. The rest are just obstacles or plot devices, and something so fundamental as healing or resurrection is nowhere to be found. Why? Rowling is obsessed with death, but magic is best written when there's balance to it. Even if you wish to concentrate on death and the negative, you have to at least pay some lip service to the fact that there is a balancing force in the universe. Otherwise, break out the leeches, Madame Pomfrey, because they're all you've got. And just to deal with the Horcrux I'm sure some of you are hanging over my head, no, Horcruxes existing doesn't have to make resurrection spells impossible. There's no end of ways to address that. Offhand, you could easily say that resurrection spells act immediately, and Horcruxes could let someone lie low until they're activated. You could say that resurrection spells can only bring back someone whose soul is still close by their physical form, or that the Horcruxes merely contain a measure of the full breadth of a powerful mage's magic, and they'd only be a shadow of their former selves without absolutely all of them. There's really no end of ways to differentiate them. But somewhat tangentially from this topic, what's up with the ghosts in the living paintings who seem to be the people painted in them? And I know the ghosts are the people they were, yet they seem to be trapped in the world of the living. Why? Wouldn't that make the living paintings a kind of Horcrux? Why don't some people come back as ghosts, and why is it that the people who die in the story never tend to come back as ghosts unless they're literally summoned by a legendary artifact? Why are so many of the ghosts completely useless in the story and have absolutely no reason to be at Hogwarts? As usual, say it with me, if it were fun magic school adventures, I could handwave that. When it becomes serious business, it becomes impossible to just casually dismiss the overt presence of spirits of the dead. Their purpose must be questioned. And speaking of questioning, the Room of Requirement's very existence is an odd and extremely problematic one. It conflicts with its own purpose in the very book where it's introduced. Its role in the story is to provide comfort and refuge, but it can't even manage to do that, and is unfortunately relegated to being little more than a stick fort in the woods. It's a pity with such potential attached to it. It was, like almost everything in Order of the Phoenix, handled exactly the wrong way, and as such adds to the number of things that seem wondrous at first but are quickly shown to be fairly miserable and mundane. The whole thing that magic can't create food is, well, bullshit. There's no reason for it to exist, and magic can create water, so that makes it seem rather suspect on its face. It, like plenty of other pointless inclusions in the world building, serves no real purpose but to be an artificial obstacle, when there could have been actually useful obstacles instead. This is yet another bit of, essentially, fake world building. It doesn't add anything to the setting, and there's no reason for it to exist, but time is actually taken on it instead of anything else that could have actually contributed to the proceedings. The Protego spell is fuck all use. Part of this is because practically no one ever uses it, period, but specifically they never tend to use it when it would actually be useful. It's brought up but never adequately explained, and then it gets to level 2 and level 3 versions later, like Final Fantasy. A Hand of Glory, despite sounding like a tool for masturbation, is not, at all, what Rowling makes it in the story. Like, at all. There are many uses for a Hand of Glory. Isolated personal light source is not one of them. Molly's various curses in her fight with Bellatrix, which I will speak about at length shortly, don't make sense. So she can fling a curse at her that kills her, but Avada Kedavra is supposedly wicked, unforgivable, and takes a tremendous amount of evil to cast. So what's up with that? Is it Confringo? If Confringo can just kill someone just like that, why would any of the Death Eaters, Voldemort included, ever use anything else? Avada Kedavra is all kinds of extra effort necessary due to its nature. Supposedly, it takes basically an evil person to give someone a completely painless instant death. But basically anyone can use an exploding curse to just murder the fuck out of someone, and that's okay. Last of all, I think it should be said that when wands end up treated and handled as TV guns after a point, it's then that it really ends up becoming far more miserable than a magic series has any right to be. This, again, happens repeatedly in Order of the Phoenix, and the parallel is impossible to miss, yet it's never brought up. The wands have become guns, and that's because Rowling is desperate to appeal to the older teenage crowd who probably thinks that guns are cool because they're idiots. Gone is the special quality of a wand, its personalized touch with the magical substances that went into its creation. Now it's a stick that can kill people. Despite this, zero repercussions for the bitch that essentially pointed a loaded gun at children who were at her mercy. I'll leave the topic with this. Cleverness can overcome anything except when the story demands that it doesn't. Real inspiring, yo. Most of the characters in the Wizarding World, as previously stated, are, well, terrible. Awful people, hot garbage and flames rolling down the street in a tricked-out dumpster. There are so many characters I could point to with really and genuinely likable presentation or premise who nonetheless end up being made horrible people by the story. The Weasleys are probably the best example because most of them truly suck ass. They're clearly supposed to be characters we like, salt-of-the-earth types who have heart. Though I will mention here, part of the tactics she used don't work on my gay ass. You are poor as shit. Stop crapping out kids. But look at Molly, whom we're clearly supposed to like, but who half-asses everything and doesn't even get off her ass quickly enough to protect her children. We're supposed to see her confrontation with Bellatrix as being a moment like Galadriel standing up to the necromancer, which, yeah, wasn't based on anything in the books and was kind of silly, but it was also impressive and visually impactful. Anyway, the situation wasn't impressive or visually impactful, it was just yet another person who waited until after it was too late to do anything without Hermione's Deus Ex Machina to actually make that okay. She never showed any real talent or ability before that moment, and it absolutely smacks of the very old-fashioned and very outmoded tendency to have only women fight other women. And I don't like that. It's a war. People are suffering and dying, and somehow no one has taken down one of the most absolutely horrible yet largely incompetent villains. This is the showdown of two of the most substanceless characters in the whole series. Molly has no exceptional qualities and nothing memorable to her at all. Bellatrix is memorable only for what a clusterfuck she is. It's especially worthy of note that Harry is tempted to kill Bellatrix rather early on, but he doesn't for some reason. He doesn't have to use Avada Kedavra, as we see when the story permits Bellatrix to finally be written out of it, but he doesn't do anything, so every person she's responsible for harming or killing is really, at least in part, his fault. See, this is the thing about not killing irredeemably horrible people who have been known, and at this point seen, to kill others. They're going to keep doing it. This isn't like real life where you might not know if a person is really guilty or, if they are, whether or not they would kill again. And yes, we're supposed to believe that killing someone is the worst thing anyone can do, somehow, in the wizarding world, but that seems kind of like bullshit, and in any case, is never really proved over the course of the books. Everyone makes a lot of fuss over Avada Kedavra, but why not Confringo or Reducto? And to get back to the original topic, does it really weigh on the soul if you're defending yourself or attempting to prevent a much greater atrocity? I honestly cannot imagine anyone's soul being particularly heavy after ridding the world of an ass pimple like Bellatrix. The situation is also noteworthy because Ginny, who is also terrible and barely even sentient with no personality to speak of other than being unbelievably obnoxious when the plot needs her to move it, is half-assedly put in danger. Molly comes out of stealth completely risking her own life, but that's the favourable way to paint it. Realistically, she's basically just pulling a stunt tantamount to attempted suicide, which is really not okay, and it's not a good thing to introduce to the story, especially if you have no intention of following through on that point. Any way you look at it, that situation is Molly's one thing that she contributes to the plot, the one thing she accomplishes in the story, and it's something that, thanks to the way it's presented, only introduces very different questions that the writer clearly had no intention of answering, if she even realized what she was doing. If you look at it another way, if Molly was such a powerful witch, why didn't she do literally anything before that moment? So it took one of her family being killed, stupidly and poorly written given, to motivate her to actually get off her ass and do something? So she couldn't perform emergency first aid or accomplish an unexpected feat of healing, because apparently the wizarding world is shit at any kind of functional medicine, but she can kill someone instantly with a single curse, which is something that is supposed to be largely impossible unless you're evil. And of course, the Death Eaters similarly have exactly zero ability in life-saving or healing. Incidentally, too, why is Voldemort so upset that Bellatrix dies? He was trying to get Harry to kill the shit out of her not long before that. And how is it that if Molly's that tough and she's just a housewife, the Death Eaters even had a chance? They already weren't that impressive if you consider you could undoubtedly just destroy them with even an ancient revolver. But judging by that fight, all we needed to do, really, was get half of the wizarding world to take the thumb out of their asses and actually give enough of a shit. Arthur's barely in the story and barely ever does anything. He might as well not even be alive during it. Percy's a shit. The twins are darling most of the time, but as with everyone else, they get one thing and then get shit on by Rowling when they, of all people, should have been able to grasp at least one real victory. And they're not the only ones who, despite the writing trying to manipulate us into liking them, are not really likable or particularly sympathetic. It's more successful with people like Dumbledore because his actions typically take more thought to analyze and find issue with. Molly Weasley, not so much. In fact, Narcissa Malfoy seems far more of a mother, and far more of someone who actually gives a fuck about her family despite her struggles with mental issues. But she's evil, because clearly caring about your husband and son and trying to support and protect them and not sitting on your ass until it's too late to help anyone is the work of villains and madmen. But most of the female characters, which is ironic with how much of a feminist Rowling considers herself, are the absolute worst characters in the series. None distinguishes herself by being particularly likable, superlative in any way, or beyond suspect. The only two women that got out looking even decent after their parts in the story were Maxime and McGonagall primarily because we just don't know enough to extrapolate about some of her actions and motivations. The idea of Tonks is not a bad one, but she's very clearly only introduced to pair up Lupin in order to deny any relationship with Sirius, which seems a lot of trouble to go to, as to avoid one of the few relationships with any chemistry. I'm not the best at names, but Nymphadora, really? Names were always a tad hit or miss, but they get insufferably lazy by the last few books. If you can change a character's name to Farty Crotch with a minimum of letters different, there is something wrong. Bellatrix is probably the worst character in the whole series. Being crazy is not good writing, or, well, writing at all. It's shorthand, it's lazy, and mental illness does not just absolve a person of all wrongdoing or somehow make them relatable or sympathetic. To contrast, Narcissa, as mentioned, was, despite barely appearing in the story in any capacity at all, more admirable a handling of a character who clearly had her battles with herself and the world at large. Bellatrix, instead, is just another cartoon villain, but not a good one. She's certainly not the lone villainess of the typical 80s cartoon. She's not as competent as the villainess would be. She's like Crasher from GoBots if Crasher were shit at everything and utterly incompetent instead of crazy like a fox and extremely dangerous and capable. Bellatrix is only capable by accident or when the script needs her to do something unlikely. The rest of the time she somehow manages to be self-parody that constantly disrupts anything and everything happening because it's impossible to ignore the grandstanding lunatic. Her presence is infuriating in its superfluousness, and that's in every scene where she appears. She doesn't even get to be a villain we hate who gets defeated by someone we care about who has any real vendetta against her. Not even the charm of Helena Bonham Carter could save her. Sorry, love, nobody can draw blood from a stone or a brilliant performance from crap material. Speaking of shitty, ill-conceived characters, why is Mad-Eye Moody even alive? It would have been so easy to kill off a character we never had really met if you wanted to kill off someone. It's not like the villains were reluctant to murder. He wasn't much of a threat, and he wasn't particularly likable either. Even when we find out more about him, it's not really good things if we think about it for so much as a moment. So we couldn't kill off Mad-Eye Moody off-screen, but we have his death mean nothing in the story, and his life mean even less. Delightful. Say it with me again. If it stayed Fun Magic School Adventures, you could hand-wave things like this. Or if it was spun off into another series for an older audience, you could possibly deal with it well, or really at all. But the Wizarding world is fucked. Right and truly fucked. From the start. And they don't fix it by the end. The epilogue is just a depressing rehash of the same machine that enabled fascism and mass murder to ascend to power. Twice! To their credit, it was made clear that they are no longer employing Dementors, but let's examine that topic first and foremost of all in deconstructing the extremely questionable Wizarding world. First off, these abominations should never have been employed. They shouldn't have been guards, and they certainly shouldn't have been allowed anywhere near a school. They are seemingly not altogether sentient and don't particularly have any instinct for self-preservation or response to distress of their own kind. Furthermore, they are mentioned more than once as being among the foulest of creatures to inhabit the earth. And the Ministry of Magic have always used them, and they only stop using them because they went to Voldemort's side. Does anyone else not see a huge problem with that? These things have one purpose and one purpose only, to leech happiness and joy from the world. They are the anathema to the very concept of the Wizarding world, and they suck out the very wonder that makes it possible on a technical level. What they do, the Dementor's kiss, is stated to be a fate worse than death. It is never explained if they really do suck out a person's soul, we can assume so, and never explained how that soul may then be freed, or if it is consumed or destroyed, which would presumably mean that a person is destroyed, no afterlife, nothing. And I ask again, does anyone else not see a massive problem with this? They not only allowed them at a school, they sent them there. They absolutely should have sent auras or some other kind of guard, not the uncontrollable, only debatably self-aware monstrosities that might, consume the souls of children and destroy them for eternity. If we are to take it as seriously as it's presented in Order of the Phoenix and beyond, this is really a potent message that shows that the government of the Wizarding world was irretrievably corrupt and broken, that the way their society exists is something that, more than anything else, fosters an environment for the rise of the great evil of Voldemort. It also really insults the protagonist that we are supposed to identify with and cheer for. It's absolutely wretched to put them through this horrific ordeal and then have them do exactly the same things their parents did, exactly the same ways, perpetuating exactly the same toxic environment that encourages the worst. It cheapens everything about all their struggles, and it only makes it feel more worthless if no difference was made and nothing really changed. All that happened was that essentially a fresh coat of paint was slapped onto the same tired old thing. It makes the whole grand adventure feel more like a pointless, incoherent waste of time. Because Dementors were just one of many problems with their society. What about the utter dearth of Muggle technology just because most all of the Wizarding World couldn't be asked to learn how to use it? Since most magic in the Harry Potter series is just convenience magic that does things that you could do non-magically, why waste so much magic and effort on things that don't strictly need it? And the whole house elves thing, why didn't they just use magical automatons like golems? Those exist. You can transfigure things into them, and this is not particularly challenging for anyone who specializes in transfiguration, like McGonagall. Which, yes, raises more than a few questions about why Hogwarts was so beleaguered and why she didn't just mobilize some sculptures before she did, or why she didn't just use, say, draconiphores and make an unstoppable wall of tiny dragons that would operate like a wall of unstoppable flame, or why she didn't have the students use Reducto or something similar to blow up the bridge instead of using the magical equivalent of C4. Whatever. Anyway, either she should have just written about James if she wanted to tell a story about a conflict with Voldemort, as I said earlier, or, actually tried to tell a good story in the last 3 books, or just done magical school hijinks. If you think about it, there's only one real story with the last 3 books of Harry Potter. Everything but the Nazi bullshit could be cut out and you'd lose nothing of value. But if you're going to do a Nazi parallel and have it make a statement, it really isn't given enough weight or time spent on it. It's just suddenly, oh hey, the Ministry is totally controlled by fucking Nazis. Wow, that happened fast, and now a couple of kids threw them completely into chaos. Wow! And even if some degree of separation between Muggle society and the Wizarding World makes sense, there would always have to be exceptions. The way these arbitrary rules are enforced in such a totalitarian manner reflects an already existing authoritarianism that is not improved upon but simply restored by the end. If we have a world of magic, we should introduce it with the requisite level of wonder, which includes people running their society in a more enlightened way, not being just a bunch of absolutist jackholes. Incidentally, owls and newts and the like, the examinations given at magic schools, are complete and utter nonsense, and as usual with everything else, they're administered in the most inept way possible. There's no consideration given either for the tremendous insanity going on at the time, and the students are still expected to take their L's at specifically the end of their 5th years. These are tests that give people anxiety problems. In the story! The Wizarding World is a miserable shithole, and owls and newts demonstrate spectacularly how wretched it is. Still, this is probably due to the fact that by the time Rowling invented them, she had lost any interest in magic school goings-on, and was just trying to railroad rush the story to its pretentious, disappointing, and inane end. There's so much creativity dedicated to things that don't matter, or are utterly irrelevant, or plot devices, like most of the artifacts introduced throughout the story, but there's little paid to things that would actually make the complete separation sensible. Where's our magical internet? Where's our magical television? Why do people raised in Muggle world seem to completely give up almost everything from that world, or never get it in the first place? Harry and his friends don't even have cell phones, and let me tell you, they were already very popular in the late 90s. Why don't we have some equivalent of digital data storage? Since information and knowledge are arguably the most valuable commodities in the Wizarding World, surely there are better ways to store and propagate it. The Wizarding World is constantly in danger from Muggle ignorance. There is absolutely no wiggle room there, that's a fact. So why wouldn't they want to create a defense of being far more knowledgeable? If you have the 2 separate cultures exist in the same world, there's just no way to have us believe it otherwise. But there they are, supposedly completely separate, but not filling gaps that would be created by such absolute segregation. To illustrate, look at Voldemort again. His original incidence was the First Wizarding War, which means he was the first one to manage to make enough of an influence to have widespread conflict over his beliefs. The segregation between the magical world and the Muggle one is so absolute that this is extremely unlikely. Even more unlikely is no conflict of note spilling over into the non-magical world. Fantastic Beasts retcons notwithstanding, it seems rather questionable on its face as a whole. Just set it in a fantasy world if you want to do medieval fantasy. If you want to do quaint business without any modern conveniences or tech, you have to make the quaint shit actually equal to or better than the things you won't include. You can't just go, no cell phones, without actually addressing why wizards don't use cell phones. Even if all you say is, well, in magical areas there's no coverage and the magic disrupts cell phone signals like a microwave will. That's something. That's more than we get for most of the tech we see them not using. Tangentially, the monetary system isn't explored enough to make sense. If a parallel were drawn between it and the pre-decimal system in Britain before 1971, that might give it a context and some sort of commentary. But that's not really ever done. The Wizarding World has a completely different, distinct system of coinage, additionally, which strangely makes it either an overly complex commentary or no commentary at all. And nobody had a gun of any kind? Not even a Gatling gun or a repeater from the early 20th century, perhaps? They aren't especially new. Even a mini Derringer would work for killing someone like Voldemort. And as dangerous as Fiendfire may be, I'm pretty sure you could just toss a Horcrux into a blast furnace and it wouldn't survive. Or hey, use the nuclear reactors the characters for some reason decide to traipse around later on. There's kind of a shocking amount of animal cruelty in the Wizarding World, which, do I have to say it? It's not necessary for the story and adds nothing to it. If anything, it takes away from it and makes it a much worse world than the Muggle world. Remarkably, one of the characters actually does make a point of it, and just as remarkably, it's Hermione, but as usual it looks like she's just jumping on a bandwagon. It's also totally ignored whenever there's an opportunity to do anything at all about it, so in some ways it's worse than saying and doing nothing to address it. Duracalls are one of the only not horrible bits. But it's a bit strange when the whole Wizarding World came together to conserve them by removing them from Muggle sight and access, yet the Wizarding World seems to have no laws even remotely approaching Muggle conservation anywhere in any capacity. Magical reagents don't have to be actual parts of living creatures and such. Macbeth is low-hanging fruit. Show a little creativity and think more about its setting and what you're establishing with it. Pumpkin juice sounds very Halloween-y, but if you never bother to make it fit as an organic part of the setting, it's just something weird that could be anything. The same is true with butterbeer. Croco is a prime example of some of the worst unpleasantness, and it's really uncomfortable. Why, logically, would anything imbue a mixture with the traits of a living frog? And which came first? Did they discover the substance and because of that decide on molding the chocolates into a frog shape? Or did they, after developing a frog-shaped chocolate, make the very unlikely discovery of a substance which makes things behave like frogs? And why on earth would you make a chocolate have to be stunned in order to be eaten? It didn't seem weird enough being in the shape of an animal? In fairness, it's often the games and extra continuity works that really ramp up the cruelty explicitly, but there's still plenty of it either implied or stated outright in the story. Like Buckbeak. Not only is Hagrid's course just basically what he always does anyway, which is get kids to do things that he should be doing instead, but it's also filled with questionable behaviors dealing with living things. But I'm sure most will remember more the major part of the plot revolving around Buckbeak getting murdered by the Ministry because Draco was an idiot yet again. Not only did this continue to overfill the plot very suddenly with major questions about the level of corruption in government for the Wizarding World, it also reflected a complete and total disregard for even magical animals with a clear sense of self. And it also showed how out of touch it was with reality. And yes, I'm aware that in this situation it's more verisimilitude than actual real-world application. Shut up. My point is, how are no students or faculty protesting them targeting Buckbeak or opposing this obvious act of bureaucratic evil? Because I will tell you, it does not matter the place or the specific institution, you are going to have serious opposition for something like this. So we know Buckbeak is self-aware and highly intelligent, yet he has his life endangered and would have been ended without people traveling in time because he barely knocked down a boy who had completely ignored the instructor's explicit directions. And Buckbeak's not the only one, of course. You'll also probably remember the dragons featured in the Triwizard Tournament. Highly intelligent, not to mention dangerous, creatures in chains for teenage student blood sport. Not that they don't already endanger all their lives in playing Quidditch, but the Triwizard Tournament ramps that up to the next level. Of course, I can't forget the dragon in chains at the bank, so neither will you. Then there's the merfolk in the lake, who supposedly agreed to participate in that irresponsible endangerment, but they certainly didn't seem to follow through with that very well at all. And why would they? Though they're not really being abused per se, the Thestrals are just pretentious and illogical. So only those who have witnessed death can see them. So dramatic! Until you consider that it's a completely unqualified criterion. If you've lived any length of time, you've witnessed autumn or picked a flower. They also are very obviously yet another product of Rowling's morbid obsession, which really doesn't help the story. Was she super-duper trying to shoehorn it in because she was sure it would get her awards or something? It just keeps getting more embarrassing until the retcon Hallows establishes totally new levels of self-unaware humiliation. Harry should never have been left in the care of non-magical people at all. There were people in the wizarding world who were completely off the grid, as it were. It makes absolutely no sense to place him in a family they had to know would be a toxic environment and endanger his very life, when they could have entrusted him to someone who would know how important it would be to bring him up properly and in a healthy manner. But since they didn't do this, how is it that all of these people show up after never having visited Harry, and they presume they know him? They never even insisted on visiting. They didn't help Harry in any way for over a decade, and no one even used the money left for him to actually take care of him. Great job! I'll say it again. Set it in a fantasy world if you want to keep it distinct. Set it in a world completely removed from the real modern world. The 90s isn't enough of a distinction, though it also probably should never have been strictly set in a specific time. Though this is more of a film problem, the uniforms for Hogwarts change sharply and abruptly, and they're plainly speaking ugly as shit. They don't even really feature house colors, and they have nothing to do with wizards, witches, or anything else related. At least in the series of The Worst Witch made recently, they have the students actually wearing things that at least in part resemble what many of the adult practitioners of magic wear, which would be much wiser to do. If you're wearing ugly garbage that no adult ever wears, why? Shouldn't these wizards and witches in training be developing their own personal style, exhibited by, virtually every single adult wizard and witch we see in the series? There's no reason for the shift either. Even if it's meant to be a distinction for more advanced students that was always supposed to be there, it wasn't. It's drab, uninteresting, and only serves to make Hogwarts seem less like a fantastical magical place where someone would actually want to go, and more like a garbage British boarding school. And I agree with Tilda Swinton that boarding school really doesn't need to be glorified. If you choose to attend one, it should be on your terms. Since Hogwarts also doesn't provide even essential supplies to students. But again, fun magic school adventures, etc. At least in the first few years, the good ones, in short, we often see them donning robes over casual clothes they choose to wear. Wouldn't it have been more fun, not to mention more appropriate, to have them just continue to develop this style into more unique, personalized robes as the years went on? We could have actually seen Harry, Ron, and Hermione develop unique and distinctive looks for themselves, which would have added a wondrous and whimsical detail. The overall color palette of the whole thing changes too, and it really ends up shockingly hideous by the end. Compare the warm, wondrous, and magical palettes of the first trio of films to the progressively uglier shit palette of the last few. And I've seen the concept art of all the films. This was a conscious choice to take fantastic concepts, sketches, and ideas and turn them into a homogeneous ugly nothing of no color or magic. It doesn't even set the mood because it's everywhere. At least if they'd kept the Wizarding World a different scheme than the Muggle world, it might have seemed a more interesting, or artistic in any way, choice. Another mainly film problem is the presentation of Durmstrang as a militaristic school when that's clearly not any such thing that exists in the Wizarding World, and it really shouldn't. If it did, it certainly seems unlikely that they would just stand idly by with the ascent of the Death Eaters and so forth. The director of this film was the idiot in this case. While I do like Victor in the film largely because his actor is so charismatic, the character from the book would have been much more interesting and appropriate and wouldn't have raised so many questions that none of the films ever thought worthy of answering. I have no way to segue smoothly into this next topic, which is this. They left the basilisk dead in the basement to rot for 5 fucking years? Is this really the best thing to do? Basilisk fangs are apparently potent magical items that can destroy nigh indestructible things with ease, so why wasn't the thing harvested for all it could give, then disposed of? Decaying corpses aren't really hygienic, and it's yet another major risk for the students of Hogwarts. It could be hand-waved, if this didn't come up in the serious business finale obsessed with bullshit retcons making everything so much worse. And who knows what kind of horrible things are brought upon them by whatever breaks down a giant mythical snake that can turn you to stone just by looking at you. Really makes Dumbledore look so much better to find out that he just fucked off instead of actually addressing major problems that could endanger the students. What sense does it make for the Ministry to bust Harry's balls for using magic in front of someone who is his family, who should already know about magic in the family, and does? And in this case it was because Dementors, who are tools of the administration, were endangering the non-magical person and compromising the secrecy of the magic world in the first place. It's not exactly difficult to trace this back to whose fault it actually is, and I'll give you a clue. It's not the person who is trying to defend himself and his blood relative that your idiot monsters compromised your secrecy to first. There's also absolutely no reason why Harry and his friends wouldn't know how to get any part of the Ministry they wished and would ever be surprised by any part of it, especially as by the time of the last book they'd been there a number of times already. Also, why do they not do more planned damage in the Ministry? It's filled with evil or complicit people, or at the very least people who are having their power used for evil. At this point, the story has gone full mercenary and there's absolutely no excuse for them just doing childish stunts instead of actually doing some real damage. People are going to die because they pulled punches and didn't plan it well. It's very clear that, as in Order of the Phoenix, Rowling still thinks she's writing a completely different series than she actually is. It's moved past kiddie pranks being able to accomplish anything. We see it didn't even work in Order of the Phoenix, though it did create a spectacle. But there were no consequences or ramifications for the villain. She didn't learn any lesson even though she should have, and she was fine, untraumatized whatsoever, and managed to survive despite ruining students' owls and all the other things I mentioned when dealing with her. Disgusting. Even more disgusting was Snape and Half-Blood Prince acting like a massive donkey dick at all points. Was there a single moment in it where he didn't do the most stupid or worst thing possible at any given moment? And how exactly did we get from point A to point B, specifically the massive leap between Half-Blood Prince and one of the worst finales any story has ever had, the Deathly Hallows? There are perfunctory explanations and hand-waving, but virtually no part of Deathly Hallows or its setting mesh very well with anything previously established. We spend so much of Half-Blood Prince puttering around with the outside world no one cares about, which aren't even what the fucking books are supposed to be about, and Harry being kept in the dark. By Dumbledore, most unforgivably. Then Deathly Hallows, and suddenly Hogwarts, the place where the most competent magic users in the world, or at least the country, should be, which is a castle, a structure designed to be highly defensible, under siege. Like, this is literally what siege weapons are made for, and I might add that Voldemort's stupid little army doesn't even really have those. Yes, Order of the Phoenix was a huge red flag for stupid shit that is the Ministry's fault, but if nothing came of that resolution, then it was a pointless fucking waste of time. And as much as I like McGonagall, why the fuck was she complicit in the takeover of Hogwarts by a bunch of insane fanatics? It isn't that hard to get rid of the Carrow siblings at all. All they did was pick on children, which is something that McGonagall, by being there and lending the place the legitimacy of her presence, was complicit in. And even more complicit in it was Snape, who was too stupid to think of any clever way to actually handle this situation without endangering the students. What a fucking joke! And we were supposed to find him sympathetic in any way? Even worse is the cartoonish brutalizing of children, which is distasteful enough, but that just makes the villains ridiculous caricatures of evil. There's this supposed philosophy of Muggles are dangerous, and they are, but no one on the bad guys is even remotely rational or reasonable in any way. None of these people are reacting to the danger of Muggles, they're brutalizing their own and using Muggles as an excuse, which doesn't make any sense. It's stupid and not in a good villain way. It's just an idiotic band of morons twirling their moustaches instead of villains that are actually frightening or competent or have any intellectual capacity. And they are resolved by being not dealt with at all. Oh yes, let's be quick to assume that somehow the new ministry aren't corrupt at all anywhere, because it's so easy to completely and wholly remove corruption from a proven dysfunctional governmental model. And then let's assume that they're sent to Azkaban, an absolutely abhorrent place even without Dementors, and kept there for the rest of their lives. People who were A-OK with children being murdered, and who encourage them to murder each other despite being wizards and witches, but we can't kill them. We'll just torture them, take away their free will, and tie them up for a significant period of time. Surely they deserve to live in misery for the rest of their lives instead of just being dispensed with. It is nothing short of miraculous that any children were left alive at all in Hogwarts. Even if the war hadn't happened, I can't imagine that there would have been too much of a graduating class, not with bloodthirsty Rowling deciding to up the stakes constantly. But of course it doesn't even flow smoothly from the previous part of the story. And now I come to my last point, and I will say this. Rowling's attempts to remain relevant are as legendary as they are meaningless. Dumbledore being gay really makes everything far more awkward and adds absolutely nothing to any part of the story, likely because she pulled it out of her ass rather than actually organically introducing it when the character was alive and the story was still going. Even a fling with Tom Riddle would have given it some relevance, but not even that is done, so it only serves to derail anything and everything. Given it probably would have been every bit as stupid to introduce some meaningless girlfriend character for Dumbledore. Straight people baby daddy bullshit is not the solution that so many pathetic writers think it is, and such a character would likely have served no purpose but to be a pointless bit of trivia that most would not even slightly care about. But at the end of the day, with so many other characters pointlessly taking up wallpaper space in the background, who cares about another extraneous character? If they were only going to introduce this character to have Dumbledore interact with her, maybe to flesh out his past and give the story someone who could perhaps carry on his legacy, maybe that wouldn't have been so bad. The thing that makes Rowling's bid for gay relevance so moronic is the fact that there's nothing in the story to give it any relevance. There's no point to it, and it makes her claim extremely suspect because it was never any part of the story. It might have actually mattered if we'd found out that Ron was gay later. She could have used that to give an encouraging, empowering message to young readers who might have identified. And God, did that character need something to identify with by the end of it. Ron Weasley, Wand Rider, would have at least given him something of a reason to be as much of an awkward twat as he tended to be by the end, and it might have made him more sympathetic. So all that obnoxiousness over the years was just him struggling with his identity? Cool, I could see that. But Dumbledore? Do you know, the only bit of retcon she's invented over the years that I was actually amused by was, well, the thing about some wizards just making a mess of their robes and scourgifying the evidence away. Given this is pretty stupid since we know they do have functioning indoor plumbing, I can see someone like Percy doing it, though. And hear me out on this. I find it amusing mainly because it's something that is ridiculous, but also whimsical, plus it deals with something that most authors would never ever address, even as a footnote after the fact. So I have to kind of applaud that. It takes a lot of courage to mention something you're fairly sure will be a bit unpopular, which is unlikely to gain you praise, especially if it's not a controversial issue or born of inclusiveness. But really, most of all, I have to say this. Rowling needs to stop. She needs to stop writing. She needs to stop posting on Twitter. And most of all, she needs to just stop and look around her, take in a breath, and stop looking like she just smelled the worst fart ever cut in the history of flatulence. Scourgify! Scourgify! In all seriousness, though, Rowling's toxicity shows through in her unbelievable ignorance, especially on social media. There is nothing truly feminist or empowering about Harry Potter. Not a single thing in those books could be presented that can't immediately be torn down by the slightest consideration. And I will add this. Girls' rule and boys' drool is a child's taunt, not an anthem or raison d'etre for a movement. It is, furthermore, not feminism. Feminism was supposed to promote egalitarian social and specifically gender roles. You can't just try and fix one part of that and simultaneously wreck the other. It doesn't work that way, and it just creates exactly the same inequality that caused and continues to cause so many sociocultural problems. And feminism is not an excuse for someone to hate men. No one has any choice over the sex they're born as, and someone's genitalia do not define them as a person any more than any other inborn trait does, such as skin color, ethnicity, family name, orientation, nationality. None of these things are defining traits. Who you are as a person and what you do as a person are those things. If you hate men so much that you try to pick fights with people and label them as men when they are not men or even male, just because you're so filled with hate, you're not fighting against something for equality. You are the something that people fight against. The Umbridge. And you're dragging people down and making them unequal. You're also appropriating someone else's movement and claiming you're a part of it. You're a celebrity, so you represent it as a well-known figure if you claim it for yourself. And that's not okay. TERFs are not okay. They're just stupid and assholes too. It's not progressive or relevant, and no one's going to be in your corner just because you claim to be okay with the gays. which is laughable with the amount she just hates on men all the time. Pick which one, Hunty. You can't have them both. It's even stupid if you look at it assuming they're inane claims. If you, for some reason, genuinely think like a TERF, which means a trans-exclusive radical feminist, then you believe that trans women are not women at all, but men who dress up in disguise as women to victimize women. Oh, whatever shall we do when men in dresses infiltrate our sacred bathrooms which weren't gendered before a few decades ago? I should point out, it's hilarious that this isn't even a point she thought worthy of controversy when Harry and Ron dressed up as girls to fool the stupid painting to get into the girls' lavatory and save Hermione's life. Like, if you have to contend with a fucking painting not opening the door for you when there is a troll that can murder whatever students are in the bathroom, there's another problem for our big pile. But the fact that just putting in the least possible effort fools the guard, there's something to be said for that. Regardless, if you believe that, really believe that trans women are just men who dressed up and in some cases had surgery, then you clearly believe that they're just men but worthy of your contempt for what they're doing and unworthy of your respect for that same reason, because they want to be women. Doesn't that consequently make your position a rather self-loathing one? You view women as superior to men, yet you can't accept people you think of as men who want to be women. Isn't this tremendously illogical and unreasonable, especially for people who share your outlook? Not that I think Rowling actually understands what she's endorsing by promoting TERFs and TERF nonsense. I think, like everything else she's jumped on, every bandwagon she's hopped aboard, and every desperate bid for relevance, that she spouted off first and thought about it later, if ever. Most of the time, I'm wholly sure she never gives a single moment's thought to what she declares so grandiosely, anticipating that everyone will be listening eagerly for another morsel of her brain droppings. Perhaps it would be better for everyone involved if Rowling, as an author and creator, simply continued to enjoy her stories in her own way and let everyone else enjoy those stories in their own way. Surely it would lend them far more longevity than what they're likely to have as it is now, with every passing year promising us more to ruin what enjoyment we got out of the whole affair. To tie this all up, Harry Potter's story is one of magic and wonder, as well as a whole lot of rubbish and nonsense. It's a story that has great ideas to it and a remarkable world fleshed out around it, though much of that is due to other creators, other artists, dedicating so much time and energy to bringing it to life. The films, the games, everything else past the books all contribute to this holistic world. And it really doesn't even work, because it has no idea what it's supposed to be. It's clear that Rowling lost her inspiration early on and then just ran out of patience or tried to re-inspire herself, which didn't work. She ruined the story with stunts catering to a morbid fixation on death and lost any sense of wonder and magic, the very thing that gives fantasy its splendor. There's still plenty to enjoy about it, though, and as it's fiction, it can be anything you want it to be. In this age of fan obsession over canon and other such nonsense, I think it's especially important to remind others that when it's make-believe, it can be whatever you want it to be. Don't let anyone ever tell you how you are allowed to experience something. You take it, make it your own, and keep it in your heart. If you love Harry Potter and the Wizarding World and make it a more magical place, good on you. I do that myself with the Lego games and some of the so beautiful art created around it. It's what you've got to do with most any story written by someone else. Appreciate the things it inspires in you and others, but don't let that stop you from being critical of the original creator if you feel it necessary. It is, after all, the best critique that comes from a place of affection and fondness rather than spite or contempt. I'm Hushjo. Thank you for listening. You're welcome. Bye.